By the end of the 1960s, America was exhausted. The civil rights movement had won major legal victories, but racial and economic disparities remained. The Vietnam War had divided the nation, and in 1974, trust in the government was shattered by the Watergate scandal. In today's episode, we'll examine the crisis of the 1970s, the rise of conservatism, and how the Cold War tensions finally began to ease. This is America in Transition, Episode 3: Crisis, Conservatism, and the End of the Cold War. Welcome, as always, to Orbits and Oracles, a griot's guide to history. Let's get into it. The crisis of the 1970s, Watergate, inflation, and energy. Richard Nixon came into office promising to restore law and order. Instead, he left in disgrace, becoming the first U.S. president to resign. In 1972, members of President Nixon's reelection campaign creep were caught breaking into the Democratic National Committee's office at the Watergate complex in Washington, D.C. The White House tried to hide its involvement, but reporters Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein of the Washington Post uncovered links to Nixon's inner circle. The smoking gun was a secret recording revealed Nixon ordering the FBI to stop the investigation, clear evidence of obstruction of justice. Facing impeachment, Nixon resigned on August 8, 1974, becoming the first U.S. president to resign from office.
If read with an open and a fair mind and read together with the record of the actions I took, these transcripts will show that what I have stated from the beginning to be the truth has been the truth. For more than a quarter of a century in public life, I have shared in the turbulent history of this era. I have fought for what I believed in. I have tried, to the best of my ability, to discharge those duties and meet those responsibilities that were entrusted to me. Sometimes I have succeeded, and sometimes I have failed. I have never been a quitter. To leave office before my term is completed is abhorrent to every instinct in my body. But as president, I must put the interests of America first. Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president at that hour in this office.
The next day, Gerald Ford is sworn in to the presidency, and within 1 month's time, the American public would quickly learn that he is not interested in being the president of the United States because Ford granted Nixon a full pardon for any crimes related to the Watergate scandal, saying it was needed for the nation to heal. And of course, public backlash ensued. Many Americans saw that the pardon was a cover up or some type of political deal, which caused Ford's approval rate to drop drastically. In all likely, it absolutely hurt any chance of him to be elected as a president. What Watergate scandal did was shatter trust in the American government. The Americans became deeply cynical about their leaders, fueling the rise of political outsiders in the coming decades. The 1970s economic crisis and energy shortage. The 1970s economy was a mess. Prices skyrocketed, wages stagnated, and the U.S. faced its worst energy crisis in history. Stagflation, a rare economic situation where high inflation occurs alongside high unemployment and slow economic growth. Consumer prices rose, but wages and job growths did not keep up. This caused by factors like the rising oil prices and government spending, leading to a weakened U.S. economy. So the 1973 oil crisis, which was the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, cut oil exports to the U.S. in response to U.S. support for Israel in the Yom Kippur War. In 1979, a second crisis followed with the Iranian Revolution disrupting oil supply again. The impact was constant gas prices tripling, leading to fuel shortages, rationing, and long lines at gas stations, worsening stagflation and deepening the economic crisis of the decade. Now, for the first time, Americans was realizing they were dependent on foreign oil. This crisis changed how the U.S. energy policies would affect and apply for decades to come. The rise of conservatism and Ronald Reagan's election. In the 1960s and early 1970s, America had moved left, expanding civil rights, social programs, and government power. But by the late 70s, many Americans felt disillusioned by big government. Enter Ronald Reagan. Jimmy Carter was dealing with conservative backlash, which was the white working class reaction to the civil rights gains, affirmative action, liberal economic policies that they believe favored minorities and the poor. But this was also the rise of the religious right. Evangelical Christians became politically active, opposing feminism, abortion, Roe v. Wade of 1970, the decision of Roe v. Wade in 1973, and the LGBTQ plus rights. Of course, the moral majority and the new right, was conservative groups like the moral majority push for the return of the traditional family values, helping shape U.S. politics back to the right and further from the left. And then in 1980, the election between Ronald Reagan and President Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan defeat the incumbent by a landslide. Reagan's campaign focused on the ideas that government was the problem, not the solution. And this encapsulated his famous quote, "Government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem." Reagan's victory marked a shift towards conservative policies and a focus on limited government, lower taxes, and a stronger military. Reagan's election really marked the major shift back to the center, headed to the right. He cut taxes, he weakened labor unions, and he wrapped up military spending. But his policies left holes and a lot of things up for debate. The Cold War's final chapter, Reagan, Gorbachev, and the end of the USSR. For 4 decades, the US, the Soviet Union, has stood on the brink of a nuclear war, but by the 1980s, things were changing. Reagan's Cold War strategy included a massive military buildup, significantly increasing spending on nuclear weapons. He introduced the Strategic Defense Initiative, also known as Star Wars, which aimed to develop a missile defense system to protect the U.S. from any nuclear attacks. Now, this aggressive stance sought to outspend the Soviet Union and push them into economic and military strain. But Gorbachev, The leader of the USSR from 1985 to 1991 introduced reforms like glasnost, which is openness, which encouraged political debate and greater transparency, and restructuring, which allowed limited capitalism and economic reforms. Under his leadership, the US and the USSR signed arms reduction treaties, including the INF Treaty in 1987, which aimed to eliminate immediate range nuclear missiles. These reforms contributed to the ending of the Cold War. Then, in the fall of 1989, the Berlin Wall coming down symbolized the end of Soviet control in Eastern Europe, triggered by widespread protest and democratic revolutions across the region. These movements led to the collapse of communist regimes in countries like Poland, Hungary, and East Germany. As the momentum for reform grew, the USSR political and economic instability intensified. So much so that by 1991, the Soviet Union officially dissolved into 15 independent republics, marking the end of the Cold War and the Soviet era. The Cold War was over. The U.S. was the world's only superpower, but was Reagan the reason? Some argue that Gorovich's reforms made this difference. But what does the legacy of this period tell us? The 1960s gave us hope. The 1970s gave us crisis. And the 1980s gave us conservatism. The battles fought over civil rights, economic policies, and foreign affairs continue to shape America today. As always, stay curious, stay critically thinking, and happy reading.